Hello, I'm Amelia Kreider, a PhD student in Natural Resources Science and Management at the University of Minnesota, and I'll be talking to you today about our project, Understanding and Building Capacity to Address Changing Water Availability in the Upper Corn Belt. This project is funded by a USDA NIFA grant and is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota and Iowa State University. So, a little bit of background about this project. In light of increases in irrigated agriculture in Minnesota and Iowa over the past few decades, groundwater availability has become a focal point for natural resource managers in the area. And with this increase in irrigation comes a new need for groundwater management that's not currently in place. And this project is aimed at understanding how farmers and other agricultural stakeholders anticipate, respond, and adapt to that changing water availability when making irrigation and conservation decisions on their land to ultimately help create a shared governance framework for groundwater management. We focused on 3 study areas: Northwest Iowa and the Bonanza Valley and Straight River groundwater management areas in central Minnesota, where there are currently groundwater management plans being piloted by the Minnesota DNR. The methods I'll be describing here today were performed in both Minnesota and Iowa, but throughout this presentation I will mostly be focusing on the Minnesota portion of the project. Throughout this project, this has been our driving question: what are agricultural producers' perceptions and responses associated with water supply risk? And we operationalize the concept of risk perceptions and responses with the following measures: climate change beliefs and risk perceptions associated with that, concerns about their farmland, risk perception associated with drought, and the likelihood of drought in their area, how they manage risk on their land, and their support for groundwater management action. This was kind of the path that this project took. We started out talking with farmers and agency employees and other conservation professionals, people with stakeholders in the agricultural field, and doing semi-structured interviews with them in both Minnesota and Iowa. And those interviews informed the survey we'll be talking about today. And we're in the process of bringing that survey data and interview data back to the communities in the form of workshops and climate scenario planning and workshops with those irrigators and livestock producers in both Minnesota and Iowa. Again, like I said, we started out with interviews with stakeholders in the summer of 2018. In Minnesota specifically, we conducted 15 interviews with stakeholders. And using the information we got from those interviews, we developed an 11-page, 28-item questionnaire that we mailed to agricultural producers in all 3 study areas that I mentioned before and that you can see here on the map. An overview of who responded to the survey in Minnesota specifically. So our overall response rate between both states was 30%, and it was a little bit higher in Minnesota with 34%. Minnesota had an N of 464 survey responses. Respondents were predominantly older males with a median age of 63 years old. This third bullet point here is where we asked respondents to report whether they have acreage that they own or rent in any of these crops. So for example, here 53% of respondents own acreage in corn. 20% of respondents have irrigation on their land, and 33% have some tile drainage on their farm, and 22% plan to extend or renovate tile drainage in the next 5 years. So one of the questions that we asked the respondents is, do you believe that climate change is happening? Here, those numbers are presented compared to the 2019 Yale poll versus our survey question of central Minnesota ag producers. We see on the left here that Minnesota producers have higher beliefs, higher belief in climate change, but lower perceptions of human sources of climate change. This 73% number is respondents that believe who believe in climate change aggregated across all sources. So some believe that it is human caused, while some believe that it is due to natural causes in the environment. And 56% overall believe that climate change is mostly natural or an equal split of natural and human caused. This was interesting because irrigators we presented this to argued that observing climate change and believing in climate change are different. And like I said before, most believe that natural causes are at least partially to blame. Here we have 3 measures of climate change risk perception that we asked respondents. Almost half of Minnesota farmers agree that their farm operation is vulnerable to drought. 41% agree that their farm will likely be harmed by climate, or 42%, agree that their farm will likely be harmed by climate-related impacts, and 41% agree that drought is a real risk to their area and their future. This shows the perception that climate change is a threat or a risk to their farming operations. These were Minnesota farmers' top concerns for their farms in the next 10 years. Decreased access to groundwater, 65% were moderately or extremely concerned about that. More frequent dry periods and droughts throughout the summer, 67% were concerned, and 69% were moderately or extremely concerned about increased heat stress on crops. All these concerns are in alignment with climate projections in the area that irrigation will become more and more necessary as summers have longer and more frequent dry days and will have higher temperatures on average. On the left here, you'll see a survey question that we asked the farmers. So over half said that a drought was moderately to extremely likely in the next 10 to 30 years in their area. And the maps on the right show a percent change from the 1980 to 1999 average to 3 future emission scenarios. And these models were built early in our project, and after we presented these maps to farmers and talked with them in interviews and the workshops that we have conducted so far, we learned that we, on our end, need to model risk a little bit differently. For farmers, instead of average longest dry spell, for example, they define drought and a dry spell as 5 to 7 consecutive dry days in a row. So our team right now is working on that modeling and looking at how frequent those dry spells will become into the future based on that feedback from farmers. Oops. Here we asked farmers about what factors would make them install or expand irrigation on their farms. The event that would least likely result in change is one bad drought year like we had in 2012, where the most likely is if a bad drought was projected every 5 years or so into the future. From our survey, we also know what groundwater management actions farmers support. Here we see that over half support adopting conservation BMPs and also support farmer-led groundwater management planning. And a little bit fewer also support collaborative groundwater management and planned and shared decision-making among farmers and conservation agencies. So what we see here is that farmers very much value their independence and autonomy, but are open to collaboration with these conservation agencies and want to have a voice in the decision-making process. So overall, what have we learned in this project? Engaging producers is very, very important in defining risk, especially in this field. Risk is, we found, defined a little bit differently between our study areas in Iowa versus Minnesota, where Iowa is primarily livestock producers in Northwest Iowa, and central Minnesota is primarily corn and soybean producers. And so climate risk and risk of drought is defined differently between those study areas. And impacts to farming operations, concerns about their farming operations, and climate change beliefs all are kind of nested within that picture of risk perception as well. Just asking farmers farmers to think about risk perception in different ways can provide us a fuller picture of that risk perception. And this has really shown us that community engagement is what should drive risk communication in the future, and science communication to farmers in the future. And then lastly, again, support for groundwater management is fairly strong, especially in Minnesota. While farmers are very autonomous and independent, they still support collaborative shared decision making. And from our conversations with producers and irrigators, there is interest in shared governance, but still having agency over their own land and over their own decisions. But overall, there's a lot of support to protect water supply and conservation action. So what is next for this project? In February in Minnesota, we held a meeting with irrigators in the area, as well as some agency and conservation professionals, to talk about what a climate scenario workshop could look like in these areas. And unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, some of those workshops have been delayed, and we were granted an extension for the project. So we're hopeful that at the end of the summer, we can hold local workshops with producers and other ag professionals to talk through some water conservation decision making based on different climate scenarios that we can present. We're also working on further analysis on our interview and survey data to help inform both those governance frameworks, and also to bring back to these communities to talk through them during these workshops. And we're also working on modifying and improving our climate modeling based on what farmers have been telling us is important to them and in their decision making. So I'd like to thank my fellow researchers at the Center for Changing Landscapes, the Institute on the Environment, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and Iowa State for their work and guidance on this project, as well as USDA for their funding on the project. I'd also like to thank our partners, Pope County SWCD, who's helped us extensively on setting up these workshops, Irrigators Association of Minnesota, and the Minnesota GNR. And lastly, thank you all for listening, and please feel free to get in touch about any questions about what I've presented today or about the future of this project.